Thank you, Rusty. This all kind of started, I was giving Jim Key rides to the Sertoma Club, and we were talking about voting and how do you do that. And he started talking about the Battle of Athens, which I vaguely knew about, but his father was a principal in McMinn County about trying to stop a sheriff who was, you've heard of the ballot box. It used to be pretty important, and the sheriff was stuffing them, and they'd had ballots in it before the race started. And the GIs coming back from World War II did not like that. But Jim said he was in a car laying in the back seat with a rifle at age 15, hearing gunshots go off, and I'll let our speaker today, the current sheriff of McMinn County, Sheriff Joe Guy, also had newspapers in the back from the day after and a couple of days after from the Athens and Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it's just an incredible story. And some people are saying vote fraud. What is that? Well, it's been around a while. But welcome and thank you for coming all the way from McMinn County Sheriff Joe Guy.
Thank you all. I'll have to move around just a little bit because I get a little antsy when I'm speaking. And I guess I need to work my computer here. Thank you again for having me. This is probably the most notable historical event that ever happened in McMinn County that we will not talk about. We don't like discussing this, and I'll explain why. Very quickly, my wallpaper is actually a mock-up of a mural that we're trying to get painted. A gentleman approached us this year to paint that on the site where this all happened. It is not necessarily to scale or a direct representation of anything or anybody except for our old jail there on the right-hand side, although if you look at those newspapers, and you'll see some pictures in this little short presentation, you'll see where he got that from. Oh, I've got it. Okay, it did occur, as Chris was saying, on Election Day of 1946. Now, to really understand what happened, we have to go all the way back to the Civil War. And during Reconstruction, most of you know how Reconstruction worked out. It was mostly a Republican, and I'm a Republican. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody here. The Republicans sort of came into the South and to reconstruct the South. Republicans took offices, political offices, in those days directly after the war with so much continued turmoil, and I'm not moving around too much. They wanted to maintain their power for fear of the Democrats and the largely Confederate Democrats coming back in and taking back over. So the Republicans began to develop political machinery. And there were outdated laws in Tennessee back then. You could be a sheriff and be a county judge. And most of you may have heard of the county court system that was in place years ago. And that was an antiquated, although at one time it was very efficient, form of local government. The county court was made up of justices of the peace throughout each county. The justices elected of themselves a county judge. And it was basically the executive, judicial, and representative branches of government all rolled into one. And as you might imagine, it lent itself to corruption as the country and the state began to be further developed. There were a lot of antiquated laws regarding sheriffs back then. A sheriff could arrest somebody and charge them 50 cents, which was big money back then. If they just brought him in and gave him a cup of coffee in the jail, they could charge him for a full meal. There is another, well, I'll tell you, I'll throw in a few other stories here. So we had those antiquated duties. We have the founding of the political machinery under the Republicans, but as that went on up into the 20th century, and this was true throughout the South, not just McMinn County. I know it's hard to believe, but you all had political machineries in Knoxville too.
Judge Bozeman. No.
Oh, you're taking it back. I didn't know that. But when the New Deal came in and Roosevelt took power, they just kind of switched it up. And I like to tell folks the Democrats just took what the Republicans had started and made it even better. And they weren't all that bad, I'll be honest with you. In our own county, it depended on who was in charge. Many times the machines were very efficient. They served the public very well if the right folks were in charge. Unfortunately, if the wrong person was in charge, it wouldn't turn out so well. The GIs come home in 1945 after World War II. They had been receiving a lot of letters, and some of them had grown up under the political machinery. They knew what it was, but you have these young, idealistic servicemen who were coming back home, who had been receiving letters that, oh, your dad's barn was burned, or your uncle got beat up, or so-and-so happened. And many times, GIs were even targeted because some of those guys, as you know, would come home on leave, and they'd have a little extra cash in their pockets, and some of the deputies of the sheriff that was in charge at that time knew that. And so when they'd go out and try to have them a beer somewhere, they would harass them and either beat them up for their money or arrest them because they knew they had money that they could fine them for. And so there were a lot of excesses going on. And we'll talk about some of the players in just a minute. But there's these young men that are across the ocean in Europe and Southeast Asia, or not Southeast Asia, but the Pacific, fighting for the principles of freedom and fair election and everything that's good and great about our country. And they're hearing these things from back home. When they got home, they were kind of fed up with it. And so you had a group of young, idealistic, energetic men who were challenging a largely older group of more entrenched men in these political machineries. That's kind of what I just said. So here, as the election day approaches, throughout the spring and the summer, there were all these big political events. The GIs banded together in a nonpartisan GI party made up of everybody. Democrats, Republicans, just a completely nonpartisan, and just ran purely on GI. And they challenged the largely Democrats, or Democrat Party, who were in office at the time in McMinn County. Everybody was expecting a huge event because this had been played up in the newspapers. When election day came that morning, people flooded Athens. There were thousands of folks around the courthouse. The population then was just a few thousand people, and there were probably equally that many more people just milling around Athens to see what was going to happen. People were who had felt like their votes didn't count for many years were suddenly empowered and showed up to vote because the GIs ran on the slogan, "Your vote will be counted as cast," and they were guaranteeing a fair election. So much so that there were at each polling place throughout McMinn County no less than 2 GI poll watchers. And that's a completely legal thing to do even today. You can have poll watchers there to watch and make sure that everything is done properly. We did have poll taxes back then, which, as you probably know, was a way to control the black vote and the poor white vote. And there were lists of folks who had paid their poll tax who were supposed to get to vote, but that was easily manipulated too. And so they were supposed to literally blow a whistle that they wore around their neck if they saw something going on in that election that day. But also at the polling places were deputy sheriffs of the present sheriff at the time, Pat Mansfield. And we'll talk about him in just a second. And so as we're just trying to set the stage for you here, it was a very heated political event. Every county office was being challenged, but it will have much more and wider repercussions as we see this. There on the right is Pat Mansfield. And Pat was what we call sometimes a black Irishman. He was not a McMinn County native, and that's probably played a big role in this. Underneath his picture, the gentleman in the hat right there is Paul Cantrell, if you can see that. Mr. Cantrell was a long-time member of our community. His family still lives there, which is one of the reasons we don't like to talk about this. Mr. Cantrell, he is the great or greater, maybe 2 greats grandson of a patriot that's buried in McMinn County. And so his family were from Etowah, and most of you might know, and Etowah just kind of popped up on the scene in 1906 as the L&N Railroad came through McMinn County and established their shops there, and which to this day causes a lot of tension between the east side of our county and the west side, because there's old Athens, the seat of government, and here's this upstart Etowah over here that's all of a sudden, Etowah actually had electricity before our county seat did. That didn't go over too well. They had telephones, and the Cantrells were investing in that type of thing. He owned utilities, he was a car dealer, and he was a public official. He was a member of the public, or the county court. In 1936, he's elected sheriff. He serves a couple of two-year terms as sheriff. They were two-year terms back then. And then he ran for the state senate. And so as the Battle of Athens is about to happen, he is actually still a state senator. But Pat Mansfield had been his chief deputy. And so when he ran for the Senate, Pat Mansfield ran for sheriff, and of course won. The years that Pat Mansfield was sheriff, that's when things got bad. Because again, Mansfield was not a member of the community. He really didn't care how hard he was on people. Whereas Mr. Cantrell was. Mr. Cantrell was a member of the community. He knew everybody. He basically took care of everybody. Well, he wanted to come back and run for sheriff with the idea of correcting the problems that Pat Mansfield was causing. And he was going to let Pat run for his Senate seat. His Senate seat. I think that Mr. Cantrell wanted to clear his power base up and one day run for governor. He was that popular of a guy. And so that's the situation. Mansfield is the sheriff. Paul Cantrell is coming back to run for sheriff again on that Democrat ticket, part of that machine. I've already told you pretty much well. Pat was actually from Cartersville, Georgia. And they had met when they both worked for the railroad. Pat, as you can see, looks like a college linebacker. He was a big, burly guy, and was much less of a good, decent communicator than Paul Cantrell was. Here is your GI candidates for most of the county offices. All of them veterans. All of them World War II veterans, except for Charlie Pickle there on the right, and he was a World War I veteran. The others were all World War II veterans. And so they're challenging for all the way across the board. All of your constitutional offices are being challenged. Knox Henry, right there on the left, was running against Paul Cantrell for sheriff. But remember, Mansfield is still the sheriff on election day. So, everybody's been in East Tennessee in August. You know what that feels like. And we didn't have air conditioning back then. So, when you figure it in this rural